our climate crisis in the long term and is very turned up and insensitive to people that are suffering right now. So with that in mind, I'm going to toss it over to Theresa to kick us off.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining in. My name is Theresa Yoon and I'm with the Service Employees International Union, Local 1, based in Chicago. For a little context, our union represents around 30,000 janitors, airport workers, security officers, food service workers in the Midwest, and our members are majority women and people of color and immigrants with various levels of immigration status. And, you know, we are unfortunately being hit really hard, both in terms of lost wages, lost hours, layoffs, and also those who are remaining at work are really on the front lines of this crisis, right? It's our janitors that are working overtime to get the schools cleaned while schools are out, and making sure that people are still getting food through CPS and the other schools. So, you know, it's been a really scary week or so, seeing just really the gravity of this economic collapse and how it's going to really impact people on the margins and most vulnerable to begin with. We're hearing a lot of already airport workers are getting laid off, and you know, these are people who are making $13, $14 an hour and have very little access to health care. And then those who are not getting laid off are not getting proper protections while working at the airport, and really being exposed to a lot of this virus. So I think, you know, the COVID crisis really highlights the urgent need that for us to build strong community and labor and environmental justice partnerships, because it's really clear that the impacts of this public health crisis is really just a precursor to future climate crises. And it's the same people who are being most harmed in this crisis. And we've seen corporations rush to shield themselves. We've seen the airline industry rush to ask for a $50 billion bailout. And what we know is that history repeats itself. And after the 2008 crash, airlines really just used their bailout to do stock buybacks and protect their shareholders and the people at the top, not the people who are pushing wheelchairs, who are cleaning the cabins, who are loading your bags. And so we want to demand that any bailouts are worker-centered, and that, you know, because it's these frontline workers who face the most exposure. And, you know, it's also quite clear that the COVID crisis is an environmental justice crisis. It's, you know, it's our members who are also living in environmental justice communities, and they are more likely to be immunocompromised or have comorbidities or elevated risk levels due to centuries of pollution and racism. And so, you know, it's at this time that we demand not only a worker-centered bailout and guaranteed sick leave and Medicare for all, but also this is exactly why we need a Green New Deal. This is why we need a jobs guarantee and a way to rebuild from this in a way that sets us up for a world where everybody is taken care of and not at the cost of our climate. And we need to see an end to deportations, and we need decarceration and unions for all, right? And we need to just really drastically reorder our society to address not only this public health crisis and this economic crisis, but future climate-related crises that will impact workers and environmental justice and immigrant justice communities. And, you know, I am hopeful in seeing that during this time, communities are really coming together to demand these things and this new vision and an expanded imagination in which we can actually build power together in solidarity, and we can take care of each other in our communities. So, you know, we're doing that not only in Local 1, but through the union across the country and internationally. But it's a huge it's a huge fight, and I think I'm just, you know, remaining grounded in my communities who are demanding just a much better world, because this was all completely preventable, and what the systems we're setting up in the future to ensure that this doesn't happen again and worse and more often. So with that, I will pass it off.
Thanks, Theresa. That's really helpful context. And again, we'll be taking questions in the chat box, but also if you're on the phone, you'll be able to raise your hand as well. So with that, Jose, I'm gonna share my screen here.
Great. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for getting on the webinar, and thanks to IEC for putting this together. My name is Jose Oliva. I am the campaigns director for the HEAL Food Alliance. HEAL stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor. We are a national multi-sector alliance representing over 1 million farmers, producers, eaters, workers in the food system. And just to give you a little bit of background, the HEAL Food Alliance was formed. I was the founder and co-director of the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is a group of worker organizations representing the entire food system. And we realized that if we needed better wages, better working conditions for our members, and if we wanted to win that, we needed to build power for workers, but we also needed to have allies in the other sectors of the food movement, right? And those other sectors are health, environment, agriculture. And so that was the genesis of HEAL. That's how we decided that we needed to pull together a broader coalition that cared about the food system as a system rather than piecemeal it and try to change things one piece at a time. Next slide, please. Oh, can I control it? No, I can't control it. Yeah, there we go. So just to give everyone a quick sense of what the foods, when we talk about the food system, what is the food system, right? There's 5 segments of the sector. The first one is production, that includes farm workers. The second one is processing, and that's both meat and poultry, but also just general food processing. The third one is distribution, and that includes warehouses, it includes the trucking industry and so forth, right, that actually gets the food from one place to another. And then once it arrives to us, it either arrives to a grocery store where we pick it up and cook it and do the prep ourselves, or it ends up in a restaurant or in another food service setting, right? There's some industrial food service settings like institutional cafeterias, at hospitals, at higher education institutions and so forth. That's the food system. That is from beginning to end. There are 21.5 million workers in this food system. And it bears the legacies, just like Theresa said, right, that there's so much of this is rooted in history. It bears the stamp of slavery and racism because if you look at production, for instance, farm workers are excluded from all of our labor laws. They're excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act. So you can literally pay farm workers less than the minimum wage. They're excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, which actually gives workers the right to organize a union. And the reason that they're excluded from that is because those jobs were held by Black workers. They were held by former slaves. Okay, I'm being moved along. Okay, no. So anyway, so that's the food system. 21.5 million people work in that food system. And there's a whole spectrum of how those workers are actually experiencing the COVID-19 crisis. So now we can go to the next slide. This is what we're hearing from some of the Food Chain Worker Alliance members around the country. The workers, I'm not going to do PowerPoint karaoke, so I'm not going to read these points one by one for y'all. You can read them yourselves. But what I can tell you is that the spectrum that we're seeing is there are people who are completely screwed and laid off, like workers in the food industry, especially in the, restaurant industry, especially the front of the house workers, right? So people who were servers, hosts, bartenders, runners, all the folks who worked in the front of the house of the restaurant industry are extremely screwed because they depended on tips, right? The tip minimum wage, for those of you who don't know, at the federal level is $2.13 an hour. Oftentimes that means that you literally would get a paycheck with $0 on it. So your tips are the only income that you're getting. And if you're not going to work and you're not getting tips, you are not getting paid. And then if you add to that the burden of being undocumented, you can't even access city or state or federal unemployment, any other benefits, right? You just can't access that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, farm workers and warehouse workers are basically being forced to work overtime, oftentimes in conditions of working with no protective gear, shoulder to shoulder with other workers, in situations where they're not being, the conditions of what coronavirus does are not being explained to them by the boss or by anyone else, right? So these workers are in the other end of the spectrum, where they're working extra hours, but still in this really precarious situation. So let's move on to the next slide. And so I just want to emphasize the pieces of the food system that are actually excluded. So tipped workers, as I said, and other workers that are excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, like farm workers, are in a much more precarious situation. We heard from one of our members, Rock. I don't know if you all know who Rock is, the Restaurant Opportunity Center. It's a restaurant worker organization. They set up an emergency fund 48 hours ago, and they already have over 100,000 workers that have signed up for emergency funds on that interface, on that website. They are now having to triage who they're going to help and who they're not, because they just don't have the resources and the capacity to deal with 100,000 people in 2 days, right? And that list is growing literally as we speak. So there's a huge amount of need out there on that end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, for folks who are working a lot, like warehouse workers and farm workers, it's not like they're getting any relief. And farm workers are not being paid overtime. They're not mandated to be paid overtime. They work piecemeal. And then street vendors are suffering more than anyone else, I think, because they are just out of work right now. And most of those workers are immigrant workers, and they just don't have any access to any other recourse. Okay, next slide. So some of the things that we can do, I talked about the emergency funds. These three items on here are definitely things that I would love for you all to pass along to your constituencies, the folks that you work with. There's some real serious questions that I think both Theresa and Colleen raised, which is that major corporations in the food system and in other parts of our economy are lining up for the the money that the government is handing out. And if we're not organized, we're going to be completely left out of that, right? But how do we organize if we can't physically come together, right? And we all know that there's two forms of power, really, right? The power of money and the power of people. And the power of people is manifested primarily through in-person gatherings like big rallies and marches and that kind of thing. And we can't do that right now. So how else, right, are we going to do that? So this is an invitation to help brainstorm what ways we can prevent these major corporations from just ransacking our coffers and running away with all the money that could potentially help so many of the people who are on the front lines who need it. And then the other thing that I was going to say that's not on here at all is just a question of immigration enforcement. We are being told that still yesterday there were raids in California. So we are not seeing any kind of slowdown on behalf of ICE. We would propose a total moratorium. I think Biden has signed on to the idea after Bernie put it out there, right, to have a total moratorium on any immigration detention, enforcement of any kind until after this crisis. I would say permanently, but at least until after this crisis. So I will leave you with that. I think there's a lot of ways that we can come together, and I invite all of us to think of the more creative ones, even if it's not physically coming together.
Thank you so much. That was really, really helpful. So Zach Kautsky with UFCW 881, pass it over to you. 1 second, you are still muted.
All right, everybody can hear me?
Yep.
Great. First off, to the Illinois Environmental Council, Colleen and Jen, thank you for inviting Local 881 UFCW to join you all today. These little moments of community are certainly appreciated and needed, and the solidarity across the progressive movement is always, always, always something beautiful to behold. So for us, just to tell you who we are, for those that might not know, Local 881 is one of the nation's largest locals within the largest private sector union in the country. We have over 35,000 members across the state of Illinois and in Northwest Indiana that are primarily food and retail workers. Increasingly, we're also getting into cannabis industry as well. And what that means is if you've been to Jewel's or Mariano's or CVS's, or if you're downstate Schnucks or Dieberg's or Kroger's in the last couple days or ever, you know who our members are. They are overwhelmingly female, almost 60%, and overwhelmingly young and minority as well. And so we always approach our view of public policy on what would most impact these historically disadvantaged communities. And that's why we strongly ally ourselves with the progressive movement and the environmental movement in that regard, because of where our members live in the communities that they call home or certainly work in, which is, I'm sure all of you know, are disproportionately impacted with regards to some of the worst practices in environmental justice. So that's who we are. Obviously right now is a pretty busy time for our members and for our local to make sure that their rights on the job, even in a pandemic, are being upheld. And, I think just, kind of as a macro view of this, for a long time, even a couple of weeks ago, people were saying, can the traditional grocery store even survive anymore with regards to Amazon Go's, which are, basically cashierless and jobless facilities, or with, increased amount of home delivery. And I think we see right now, obviously, grocery stores and pharmacies and retail outlets are essential to a functioning society, and one certainly in a crisis mode like we are right now. And I think ultimately it just kind of maintains, even in the social distancing world, a little bit of humanity that a lot of people really might be needing right now, that you can see your typical cashier or clerk at the store, give them a head nod, an elbow bump, and have that human connection that I think a lot of people are certainly yearning for, in realizing how important it is that you might not have just a little bit ago. So we obviously are not facing the same issues that our brothers and sisters at Local 1 SEIU are facing right now. We have jobs and will have jobs all the way through this because our stores are being flooded. We will, oh, sorry, my little daughter's coming to say hi. Hi, Harper. Bye, Harper. Okay. If you want to join, we might be joined here by my daughter. This is Harper. Hi, everybody. You know, one, I should probably mention too, if you are in a position right now or know somebody that has been laid off, you know, go online, Jules and Mariano's and CVS, and I'm sure a bunch of other non-union grocers are absolutely hiring right now. Particularly the union ones are good, stable jobs with good pay and benefits therein. So if you need to get through this pinch for as long as it'll last, you know, the grocery industry is certainly in a position to hire right now. But what we've really been presenting to our you know, local electeds and statewide and federal elected officials is to treat these workers, again, disproportionately from disadvantaged communities with the you know, seriousness that they need to be right now, so that they can remain on the job and they can do so safely to make sure that folks can access their medicine and their food when, you know, very likely we're all going to be told to shelter in place. And so we had put out this week a couple times to elected officials all across the state and at all levels of government requests that our workers are designated as first responders. You saw it yesterday, a couple governors, Michigan, Minnesota, and Vermont indicated that grocery and pharmacy workers would be first responders, which means that they would be able to access public benefits like child and elder care, that they would be able to, in a situation of a quarantine or a shelter in place, be able to get to work safely, that they would be able to have guaranteed 2 weeks paid sick leave to them if they themselves are diagnosed or if a family member is as well. You know, again, we've been pushing as well for hazard pay. Our companies are making record profits right now and probably will be for the foreseeable future. We need to make sure that they are sharing in that wealth with those that are allowing those stores to operate continually and safely as well. So we've that conversation has very quickly changed, where a couple of days ago we were probably told to, you know, buzz off with regards to that, to now they're seeing that to keep people on the job and to keep them safe and showing up, they would very likely be entertaining paying them more to do so. And thankfully, with a union contract, we have avenues to be able to demand that. We also are asking that, you know, workers are given the opportunity to take breaks so that they can go and wash their hands and have opportunities to clean their workstations. If you think about it, you know, at the self-checkouts, which we are obviously opposed to, hundreds of people a day will be coming through and touching a screen. What's the guarantee that those are being cleaned so that there's not, you know, a source of infection at that? For those staff checkouts,
Oh, do we just lose Zach? I'm gonna blame Harper for that one.
Yeah, I think we just lost him.
All right, I think he will probably join back on in a second. And I know we have some time for conversation here and still some time for questions. So again, I'm gonna unmute Jose here too. And if folks have questions, try and use the chat or the raise your hand feature, which you should be able to see. Oh, his computer just restarted, not a problem. I guess I'll touch on something that, you know, I think Tanisha said, and then Theresa, and has been a thread, you know, in the immediate, for folks that are on this call that are in the environmental community, recognize that this is the reality of millions of Americans. And this is about putting, you know, our neighbors, those communities first and foremost. You know, even at IEC, we sent a note yesterday we have a robust legislative agenda, and we have other things that as the environmental advocacy community we want to accomplish. This isn't necessarily the time to be prioritizing those components or to be advocating on things that aren't critical and essential. This is a time to be raising up some ways we can help, and I'm going to put some things in the chat, but I know Jose mentioned making sure that we all sign petitions that there shouldn't be ICE raids during this time, and immigration reform, as well as decarceration, and to Zach's point, signing something in support of our grocery workers being identified as first responders. Those are ways in which we can all drive our networks and our grassroots and our advocacy to those types of issues right now. And I know IEC has been thinking about how we channel our members, and there's a lot of grassroots support here. I've heard from groups like Chicago Votes and Sierra Club. We're all kind of thinking about how we do that. But then, Theresa also talked about resiliency, and I think I'm curious for both Jose and Theresa, maybe you could help answer this. When we talk about using this moment and looking ahead and building more resilient systems, we're really talking about building support for creating clean, healthy, robust, resilient communities. And that has to be intersectional. But maybe it's hard for us to think too far into the future, but how do you view a path forward in what our communities need to do together to really plan for those resilient communities that take at the heart of all these things that we're discussing about together?
You want to give it a shot, Theresa?
I was just going to say, you want to go ahead, Jose?
Sure, I can start. I mean, there's been a lot of we're a coalition, right? So we have over 50 members, and they're all over the country, and a lot of what we are hearing from them is that they have gone from an approach of let's try to figure out how, we were already on the defensive in the Trump world on policy issues, on workplace issues with employers. We were already fighting a defensive fight. What has happened now is that fight has become almost a fight for survival for a lot of folks. And so the way that people have shifted, the way that organizations have shifted their approach has been really around triaging. It's really about how do we identify folks, our members, workers who are either at the point of actual homelessness and have no food to eat, and get them the resources that they need in order to just survive. Sort of our category 1, right? And then category 2 are folks who are in a danger of getting to that place of losing income, losing whatever. And then category 3 are folks who are in a position of helping the first 2 categories. And then just sort of making, so a lot of our members have become almost network weavers at this point, right? Instead of organizing to fight to win something or to fight back against something that an employer or a government agency is trying to do to them, what they're doing now is organizing their own members so that they can support each other. And of course, I'm talking about smaller worker center organizations, not the unions, not UFCW or SEIU. They could Theresa can talk about SEIU and about UFCW, right? But the worker centers, the smaller worker organizations are in many ways less resourced, but in a lot of ways less resourced than kids, and also in closer to the ground, right? They're actually dealing with workers in much more precarious situations. They don't have a union, so they don't have a contract, they don't have any benefits or any of the other advantages, I guess, that you would have with a union. So that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I know we have Zach back on now. And Zach, we're kind of just talking about moving ahead. How do we use the lessons that we're learning day by day as things evolve to really build more resilient communities in every sense of what that means, but for workers, for the environment, for public health, you know, from childcare to immigration, how do we start having this conversation? I know UFCW and other labor partners, SEIU, participate in groups like Forward Illinois and Sierra Club does. And I think that this will continue to show the strength of intersectional movements. But Theresa or Zach, do you have other kind of thoughts on that point?
I'll just chime in and say, don't postpone those restart your computer notifications because they happen times. So sorry for dropping off there, everybody. Couldn't even blame it on Harper there.
I did.
All right, fair. You know, I don't know where I got cut off, but, you know, I would just say, you know, because of who our members are and the work that they do on a day-to-day, I hope coming out of this, people realize that these are essential workers. They should be valued as such, particularly in a moment of crisis like this. They're typically doing so at not great pay or wealth in comparison. You know, I think kind of the more beautiful thing coming out of this will probably be nobody is clamoring for the bankers and the financiers at this moment. They're all clamoring for our teachers and our grocery workers and our healthcare workers and our hospitality workers. And the solidarity coming from the labor movement and into the wider society is hopefully something that people will remember for a long time going, that our society functions, and when these workers are taken out of the economy, the impact is felt by everybody and in fairly short order. So maybe we should value them and guarantee that they're getting benefits therein. What I can say, you know, for building a longer term, healthier society coming out of this, that everybody can use their quarantine time to do would be to advocate for paid sick leave for all workers. That is a bill, SB Senate Bill 471, and I'll type that in the little group chat here. Senate Bill 471 is a bill that we've been working on, thank you, IEC, is a bill that we've been working on for years now to extend paid sick leave benefits to over 1 million workers outside of Chicago and Cook County who don't have access to a single day off if they or a loved one gets sick. And so this now obviously, not to use a phrase from Rahm Emanuel, but never let a good crisis go to waste, I think has highlighted the massive holes in our social safety net and for just general, you know, bottom line core benefits to workers of all types, that if you're sick, you should be able to stay home and take care of yourself and not infect your coworkers or the general public. And paid sick leave would be able to do that. Again, that's Senate Bill 471. So use your time to reach out, particularly to your House members and your Illinois House members, and encourage them that when we go back to Springfield, they are able to do the right thing by millions of workers and their families and our overall economy and society in getting paid sick leave out to them.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's been some questions about resources in the chat, so I just want to let everyone know that IEC is compiling a list of sites you can check out and ways you can help out as well, but also people have started posting them in the chat, so you can always look at them right now. Also, I have a question to ask, more so for Zach. Going back to how grocery workers and pharmacists are first responders, do those type of workers get a say in becoming a first responder, and what does that mean? Like, do you get additional benefits and resources to help with that, or is it kind of you have to go into work? So can you explain that a little more? You are on mute. It's *6 to unmute, and I'm trying to unmute you right now.
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
So, and if you can all see, our conversation is so riveting that we've lost my co-worker today. But The first responder designation is something that we've requested on behalf of our workers to the elected officials. We have certainly seen within the last 24, 48 hours, more and more workers calling their union and saying, I've got real concerns about being in the stores right now. So we have asked for that designation to come through. You know, when the governor and the mayor determine that we are in a state of emergency, they are given broad power to determine how and when the workforce and logistics are managed in that time. There's priorities that come through with that. And I think we would all agree right now that making sure that our grocery stores and pharmacies stay open and are safe for both the worker and for the customer to be in is something that is absolutely in the power of the executives right now. And so we've had good conversation both with the mayor and the governor's offices on that. We're hoping to have some fairly timely designations therein. I mean, one of the biggest things, I'll just give an example, is we want to make sure that our workers, again, 35,000 of them, are going to be able to get to work if there is a shelter in place. So we would want them to be deemed first responders and then be able to say that they have access to child and elder care so that they can leave their families, you know, at home safely, but that there's zero, you know, crimp then within the labor supply line to keep these stores stocked and sanitized and functional. And along those lines, then making sure that they can, if they're on the street and stopped at a, you know, by a police officer or somebody, they'd be able to show their union card or their, you know, company ID and say, this is, you know, so that I can get through to go to work in that end. So really kind of the first responder designation is a wide range of benefits that come therein, and it can really be determined by our executives.
Thanks, Zach. Theresa, do you have anything that you'd also like to chime in here?
Sure. I think just going back to your question about resiliency and how do we build resiliency, I think what's pretty clear is that out of the package that was recently passed, the emergency response package at the federal level, there are just major carve-outs for big employers. You know, any employers over 500 employees are exempt, or fewer than 50 employees can seek a hardship exemption from providing emergency paid sick leave. Like, these are the types of carve-outs that absolutely do not build resiliency. And so there are a lot of short-term, like Jose said, like triage issues that we need to address immediately. But long-term, I mean, the way that everything is set up systematically to exclude immigrants and undocumented immigrants from any sort of response or aid or access to healthcare is gonna just prevent any sort of like meaningful, resilient response at all levels of the food chain and production chains. And you know, I think things that we need to advocate for are, you know, if they do start some form of a UBI, you know, how are people that are housing insecure or experiencing homelessness or undocumented, like how are those people able to access those resources? And it's those kinds of carve-outs that are really concerning and upsetting and frankly unsurprising that our government would choose that. But it's addressing these sorts of holes that are not just small exemptions, but major portions of our economy and of our population. You know, how are we addressing those kinds of issues and gaps in order to truly build a resilient society coming out of this? How are we thinking more structurally about debt and student debt and other things of that nature that impact just things at so many different levels? So I think it's, we have to think more broadly and more creatively about how we have any sort of response to this, not just for the short term, but for the long term rebuild.
I would also just chime in and say, I think we're obviously seeing too, the way that our modern economy has been developing, now kind of meeting, you know, a crisis moment. So everybody's using Grubhub and Instacart to get their supplies and food to them, but those workers are completely denied the rights to advocate for themselves because they're independent contractors. They're, i.e., not employees of these multi-billion-dollar platforms based in Silicon Valley that are literally just getting around labor law that's been in place for 100 years to make massive profits. And so that's an issue that we've been working on for a long time. And I know IEC wants to be in that discussion because of the environmental impact of that. But, again, look at the majority of what those kind of workers are, who they are. Overwhelmingly lower income, minority workers, plenty of immigrants therein. And they're going to be denied by these billion-dollar companies the ability to access paid sick leave, access healthcare and the like, because they're not actual employees. So I think, again, hopefully there will be a realization that these workers absolutely should be treated as employees and given the intuitive benefits therein.
And I'll just, oh, go ahead, Jose.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one quick thing to Zach's point. 100% in agreement that they should be considered employees and not independent contractors. When that happens, I'm not saying if it happens, when it happens, we have to also consider the reality that we have a tipped minimum wage in this state, which actually would make those workers even lower paid than what they are right now, because they would be getting a tip minimum wage of $4.65 an hour. So when we do fix that that loophole, we have to make sure that the either we pass some legislation that eliminates the tip minimum wage, which, as I said earlier, is a legacy of slavery, or we have to make sure that whatever the fix is legislatively with the independent contractors eliminates the possibility for those employers to make these workers tipped workers rather than full wage workers.
Yeah.
Yep. We have a question in the chat for Theresa, and it's from John Delury. He wants to know, especially with thinking about how to be sensitive with advocating for policies right now in the pandemic, how do you educate and advocate on policies represented by the Green New Deal, given one, COVID-19 sensitivities, and two, limitations on in-person organizing?
Good questions. I think in advocating, to me, the vision of a Green New Deal, or on a state level, the Clean Energy Jobs Act, is one in which we prioritize low carbon work to rebuild and fight against climate change. And I think, one of the reasons SEIU endorsed the Green New Deal is because it is so comprehensive in that it includes, it wants all these jobs created to be union jobs, and it calls for a jobs guarantee and Medicare for all. And it's these comprehensive stimulus packages that we need exactly in a time like this, when the economy is falling apart and we're facing at least 20% unemployment and mass layoffs over the next year to 18 months. And so how are we responding to that? We do not want to go back to the way things were. I have no interest in returning to normal if it means a capitalist economy in which, CEOs are just in the 1% are exploiting workers and paying people a sub-minimum wage or even a minimum wage with no health benefits, right? We have no interest in returning to that. And so I think this is the time that we do advocate for a broad and bold new vision that addresses all of those things and says, no, we can't go back to normal, in which we subsidize oil and gas industries, which they're already bailing out in this time, and we can't subsidize the airline industries if they're going to continue to pay their wheelchair pushers a sub-minimum wage. And so I think it all just builds on each other. And in terms of the limitations on in-person organizing, it's always difficult if some of our most effective tactics as a movement is to mobilize and to disrupt business as usual. And I think we're all just getting very creative on what does digital organizing look like. And business is already, as usual, disrupted. And so what does it even look like to show power across all of our industries in solidarity with each other to demand this new vision? And, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of like digital organizing, but that's certainly a challenge, and I welcome people's input on that for sure. But I think,
and I know,
you know, starting these conversations are really important.
For folks that are going to continue to tune into some of these conversations, I think they will overlap. I know Caroline Wooten from Sierra Club, who's listening in today, is also going to help us host a conversation around how do we do more digital and virtual organizing during this time as well. Again, we're going to continue to send links to ways you can directly help. If you have burning questions, we have a few more minutes and you can raise your hand using the feature. If you're on the phone, you hit *9 and that should raise your hand. We can unmute you. And I think too, just as the environmental community, when we're thinking about some of these short-term emergency responses that are happening, whether that's bailing out airlines or preventing disconnections for energy or for water or other utilities, what are the long-term conversations around that? If it's great that we're not disconnecting folks' waters, but like, why don't we have equitable water rates where they can afford their water to begin with? There's all kinds of ways in which again, the social and racial issues at the heart of this pandemic are also at the heart of all of our environmental initiatives. And so I'm really excited that IEC continues to work with partners like SEIU, UFCW, and the HEAL platform.
Also, just to add to that, thinking about the other side of things, some of the ways we have been rolling out initiatives to roll out to help people with the pandemic don't work for everyone. Like in terms of a lot of universities moving to online platforms, realizing that not everyone has access to Wi-Fi or a laptop at home. Students are being moved off campus when it's the only reliable housing that they have. So like to the other side of that, like what type of long-term initiatives can we have to create kind of a social safety net? So, you know, in case we have to do something like this again, people aren't scrambling to figure out how to get resources that we rely on for a pandemic to people where like it's already in place that you have them.
Yeah, great point, Tanisha. And for folks that are also interested in some of the conversations that HEAL has and our other partners about like local food economy. Yesterday, our webinar was all about the right to garden, which is an issue we've been fighting here in Illinois, but certainly just this time is really showing how not having a diversified or local food economy is really, really hampering our ability to have clean and healthy food as a society. And again, with all of this intersection, a lot of the workers in some of these unions also who live in environmental justice communities or live in food deserts. And then on top of that, it's all kind of self-compounding. So I see that we've got some resources in the chat, but I don't know, Tanisha, I guess we could let our guests close out a little bit with some last thoughts, since we don't have too many questions still coming in. And with that, I'll go in reverse. I'll start with Zach. I'll unmute you.
I would just say to everybody for dialing in, thanks. This was a nice break, I think, in everybody's day, and obviously for the work that you do on a daily basis helps this guy and this dad know that the little girl that was falling asleep in my lap is going to have a world in which she'll actually be able to live and thrive in. So thank you again for all the work, particularly that you do on a day-to-day basis. And I would just say, ultimately, when you're in the stores, when you're going to be able to in the next couple of days, don't reach out and touch somebody, but offer some kind words and thanks to the workers that are really putting themselves on the line right now, and the stress that they're certainly feeling for themselves and their family. And when you've got some downtime in the next couple of days, reach out to your state rep and ask that they At minimum, sign on and support SB 471 so that we can get paid sick days as a guaranteed right for all workers, because we've certainly seen the need for that now. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Zach. Jose. Do we have him unmuted?
There we go. Yeah, same here. I'm just going to echo what Zach just said. I think it's really great to have these conversations. I think to the extent that IEC has been a leader on not just environmental issues, but that has really understood the interconnectedness of all of these issues and how health and the environment and labor and all of the other issues that we all care about are very seamlessly interconnected, that we continue to have these conversations. I really want to invite everyone to think creatively about how do we demonstrate power? How do we organize masses of people and demonstrate that power without the ability to be out on the streets, right? That to me is what I want to leave you all with, is just the thought or the ability to try to figure that out together, because that's the only way that we're going to move to the front of the line in this moment, right? And that's the only way that we're going to be able to survive, is if we demonstrate power.
Thanks, Jose. Theresa.
Thank you, and just echo Jose and Zach and all of their things, and grateful to the IEC for convening these great conversations. Right now, we're asking everyone to call their senator and tell them to pass a bill that includes fully paid sick leave and emergency family leave for all workers, and not just, with no exceptions to size, and including healthcare providers. We're asking, to put workers at the center of any industry relief, economic security for every single person, fully funded healthcare, not dependent on immigration status, and make sure that our healthcare system is fully supported and ready. I can share these demands and a phone number to call your senator in the chat and with IEC if they want to send that out.
Certainly.
So
and
so much.
I can just say this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate Theresa, Jose, and Zach, all the work that you guys do day in and day out, but certainly taking the time today to have this dialogue with all of our members who I know are really interested in how they can be allies and how we can continue to support. We'll send around a list of some of those petitions and resources and tips and ways we can all be supportive. And I know Tucker's in the chat sharing where you can find all of these webinar recordings. And we're going to be continuing these weekday lunch series moving forward. Tanisha, did I forget anything? You want to wrap us up?
Nope, I think this was a great discussion, and hopefully it'll help you navigate the rest of this pandemic and make sure that, you're being really thankful and grateful to the people that are still out there working, always keeping us hot context, like we can still do work to help clean up our environment and address the climate crisis in a substantive manner. And we hope to see you at other IEC webinars, especially the virtual organizing one, since it was mentioned already. Really excited for that. Yeah, and consider donating to IEC to help make sure that we can continue to do this great work and continue to do last-minute webinars that we thought of in a day. Great creative team that we have here. And yeah, thank you for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.